I'm very happy to introduce Wendy Chapkis because I know her. Wendy's a professor of sociology and women and gender studies at the University of Southern Maine. Her publications include Dying to Get High, Marijuana as Medicine, Live Sex Acts, Women Performing Erotic Labor, and Beauty Secrets, Women and the Politics of Appearance. She's the author of numerous articles in the field of drug policy, including Terms of Surrender, Marijuana Legalization in the United States, The Trouble with Mary Jane's Gender, Gender Politics in the Marijuana Policy Reform Movement, and Cannabis, Consciousness, and Healing. She's currently studying marijuana legalization efforts in the state of Maine. Wendy Chapkis.
Well, happy Earth Day, everyone. Wow, this is really loud. This is a really remarkable time for those of us who've been engaged in drug policy reform, especially for those of us who have been active in the marijuana reform movement. Now, almost 200 million Americans have access to medical marijuana. 60 million live in states where prohibition has ended on all adult use. And I think even under the blight of a Trump presidency and with a drug warrior like Jeff Sessions as Attorney General, it's clear that marijuana prohibitionists are losing in the United States. We're losing the war on drugs, at least in terms of that one drug. So it seems to me that it's a good time for us in the psychedelic science and activist community to reflect on what we can learn from the successes of the marijuana legalization movement. They've blazed a really interesting, well-marked trail, and I'm sure it's tempting to think that we could just follow it in terms of other psychoactive substances and prohibition that way too. But what I want to do is suggest some of the roadblocks, the hazards along the way that we might want to take into account when we think about how to legalize other psychoactive botanicals. So I'm going to lay out 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 lessons. We'll see how much time we have here. So the first one is that we need to prepare for a very steep climb ahead. In particular, botanicals face special challenges in being recognized as legitimate medicine. And the problem is rooted less in the specific properties of the plants than it is in entrenched ideology about what medicine is and isn't in this country. In large part, that is because botanicals aren't defined as real medicine in our imagination, because at the moment of professionalization of medicine in the 19th century, so-called regular doctors, they defined themselves as such, who are almost exclusively men, distinguished themselves from what was called root and herb practitioners, many of whom were women, through the use of stronger, often more toxic drugs. And the sidelining of what is often called crude botanicals in favor of single compound pharmaceuticals has reverberated throughout the period that I have been studying the medical use of marijuana. For example, in the early 21st century, the then assistant drug czar, Andrea Barthwell, told a congressional committee looking at the legalization of medical marijuana that cannabis shouldn't be considered a real medicine because, she said, quote, "it's not just a single drug. It contains more than 400 chemicals." She furthermore argued that the delivery system was too primitive to be a real medicine. According to Bolka, quote, "there's nothing that tells us from the science now that a smoked crude botanical should be a medication." As I discuss in the book that I co-authored with Richard J. Webb, Dying to Get High, Marijuana as Medicine, in order to understand why some drugs, but not all, get labeled medicine, and why some practitioners, but not all, are considered real doctors, it's important to ask who beyond the patient benefits from these kinds of distinctions. So lesson number 2 flows from that. Don't rely on toll roads on the path to the end of prohibition. In a culture of for-profit medicine, benefit is often narrowly defined in strictly monetary terms. The medical marijuana movement itself has been deeply divided over whether the path to profit has been the best way to move toward an end to prohibition. Currently, the most common form of legal medical marijuana provision is through commercial dispensaries. Some of them serve a few hundred patients, others serve hundreds of thousands of patients. I realize I actually have some slides here I could show you. We're not there yet, though. The dispensary in Oakland, Harborside, for instance, has a profit of about $25 million a year, or revenue at least of $25 million a year, and serves more than 200,000 patients. As those numbers suggest, dispensaries can be very efficient in serving large numbers of patients, but for-profit provision has some significant limitations. The legalization of therapeutic botanicals pursued solely through the marketplace denies access to poor people. Even with the preservation of the Affordable Care Act, over 10% of the population in this country, and that's millions of people, don't have access to health insurance. And even for those lucky enough to have coverage, botanical medications are almost always excluded. In a discussion of medical marijuana with a patient, Sherry Paris, she challenged the idea that for-profit legalization is an adequate goal. She says, if I'm a sick person and my finances are being destroyed, and believe me, that's what happens to sick people in this country, I need a different model for medical marijuana than dispensaries. They aren't interested in the people who can't buy their product. But the point is, most people couldn't survive a terminal diagnosis economically, even if they managed to somehow survive it physically. It brings up the underlying issue of the failure of the marijuana reform movement to look at issues of poverty and illness in any significant way. The issue of prohibition can't be solved without resolving the war on the poor, said Paris. So lesson number 3, we've got to seek alternative routes in addition to the for-profit road. To avoid the dead end of for-profit legalization, some medical marijuana advocates have long focused on preserving the right of individual cultivation. Currently, patients' right to grow their own medicine is protected in some states, for instance, California, Colorado, and the state that I live in, Maine, but not in others, most notably Washington State. Another not-for-profit strategy involves patient cooperatives in which members collectively grow and redistribute marijuana outside the formal marketplace. And this is an image of the WHAM garden. I studied the Women's Alliance for Medical Marijuana. It's the basis of the book, Dying to Get High. Despite the differences, both not-for-profit models of individual and collective cultivation, as well as the for-profit dispensary model, represent a real challenge to the predominant form of medicine in the US, which is pharmaceuticals. And Big Pharma is well aware of the threat of medical marijuana. They recognize it both as potential competition and also as a potential opportunity. Over the past couple of decades, Bristol Myers Squibb, Eli Merck, GW Pharmaceuticals, and Pfizer have all sponsored international conferences on cannabinoid medicine. In 2011, Investor Place News asked, could legal pot give Big Pharma a much-needed high? I'm not quite sure why it's much needed. They're making record profits. But in any case, the story pointed out that medical marijuana sales in 2011 had already breached the $2 million mark in states where it had been made legal. And Investor Place News asked, if the US federal government ever legalizes marijuana, sales would probably make the $11 billion Pfizer raked in on Lipitor worldwide look like chump change. Will it happen? But whether those dollars will be captured by Big Pharma is far from certain. Worse yet, from the perspective of the pharmaceutical industry, is the fact that botanical cannabis is starting to replace existing pharmaceutical drugs for some conditions. In medical marijuana states, prescriptions for painkillers and antidepressants have fallen sharply compared to states without medical marijuana laws. Clearly, Americans are eager for less toxic, more natural medicines. More than a third of us already use some form of what's called complementary or alternative medicine, and botanical medicine is by far the most common. The response by Big Pharma involves not only efforts to create synthetic versions of botanical compounds, but also, in the case of cannabis, directly funding opposition to the legalization of marijuana. In 2016, for instance, the pharmaceutical company Insys Therapeutics was the largest financial backer of opposition to marijuana legalization in the state of Arizona. And a year after they successfully defeated that legalization measure, that is about a month ago, Insys secured federal approval to market their new synthetic pharmaceutical cannabinoid drug, Syndros. From the perspective of the pharmaceutical industry, then, botanical cannabis is serious competition. For less widely and frequently used psychoactive botanicals, such as psilocybin mushrooms or ayahuasca, they're unlikely to pose the same level of threat to pharmaceutical interests. But the question remains, should the pharmaceutical industry be the only portal through which individuals are legally able to access plant-based psychoactive medicines? Or should patients like these in this photo be able to grow and make their own medicines? Other psychedelic researchers interested in other psychedelic medicines need to really consider this, because it has been very useful for medical marijuana advocates to be agitating alongside a well-organized, strong, well-established movement that has been arguing for broader adult use. That has meant that there has been resistance to full pharmaceutical control of the plant. Lesson number 6. We have to be extremely aware of the legacy of racism and colonialism in our efforts to end prohibition. The war on drugs, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, has disproportionately been a war on people of color. Legalization efforts that do not center race will remain grossly inadequate. As we can see, there are too many white faces in this room and not nearly enough people of color, and we have to do better than that. In this regard, the marijuana reform movement has been a failure, in my estimation. Legalization is sadly reproducing rather than challenging racial inequalities. A recent Colorado Health Department report noted that in the first 2 years of full legalization in the state of Colorado, marijuana arrests for Latino youth rose more than 20%, and for Black youth by more than 50%. Meanwhile, marijuana arrests of white teenagers fell by more than 10%, or by almost 10%. So not only are racial minorities continuing to be swept up into the criminal justice system, they're also being excluded from the green rush that has accompanied marijuana legalization in the US. Recently in the state of Maryland, the Legislative Black Caucus demanded disbanding the Maryland Medical Cannabis Commission because not one of the 15 cultivation licenses went to firms owned by African Americans. And by some accounts, only about 1% of the more than 3,000 storefronts that dispense marijuana in the US are owned by African Americans. 1%. This is particularly shocking when you know, as this chart indicates, that African Americans were disproportionately affected by this war on drugs and were a population that were disproportionately arrested for the sale of marijuana. So that they should be excluded from the benefits of legalization is particularly horrific. So as marijuana policy reform makes clear, an end to prohibition isn't an end to the road. There's a tremendous amount of work ahead for all of us, including those of us who are interested in marijuana legalization. We have to really focus on dismantling mass incarceration. We have to be very concerned about the new Jim Crow policies that accompanied it. And we have to be concerned that an end to prohibition includes the people most harmed by prohibition. I think this is relevant to people who are interested in other psychoactive botanicals, and it's been very heartening to me to hear repeatedly at this conference people raising the question of racism and colonialism and talking about substances like ayahuasca or peyote. This is true because white people are now very interested in substances that were cultivated in and historically used by the global South. and a failure to pay close attention to historical inequities and contemporary material interests fighting for control over psychoactive botanicals could produce a kind of legalization that would formally end drug prohibition, but would undermine the vision of broader social change that drew so many of us to those plants in the first place. I want to end with something that I think the marijuana reform movement can learn from scientists and activists fighting for the legalization of other psychoactive botanicals. And that is my final lesson. That is, don't run away from the therapeutic value of the high. Now, that might seem obvious to those of you who are working on ayahuasca or psilocybin. It was apparently not obvious to those working on the medicalization of marijuana. One of the things that struck me when I was working on this book was how much of the, at least mainstream rhetoric around the medical use of marijuana revolved around physical symptom relief, and how little talked about the psychoactive effects of the plant. And when it was spoken about, it was often spoken about as if it were an unwelcome side effect that could somehow be eliminated through the pharmaceuticalization of the plant. The early reports in the media around medical use of marijuana talked about easing cancer chemotherapy-related nausea, or enhancing appetite in patients suffering from wasting syndrome, or relieving spasticity associated with MS, or ocular pressure issues in people with glaucoma, or seizures among epileptics. So the high seemed to either not exist when people use the substance medically, or, as I said, was seen as an unnecessary side effect. And in fact, that's in part because of early work by people like Raphael Mechoulam, the Israeli scientist who did much of the early cannabinoid research, who said, for instance, quote, "The valuable medicinal properties of cannabis, the analgesic, anti-glaucoma, antiemetic effects, are not necessarily linked to psychotropic effects, which I regard in a medical context as a side effect." Of course, it's easy to understand why researchers would have downplayed the high in the context of the war on drugs. If the botanical didn't have significant consciousness-altering properties, it's hard to imagine that it would have been the focus of such extreme regulatory attention. But the strategic decision to deny or downplay the possible therapeutic value of the psychoactive effects of the plant didn't at all reflect the reports that I was getting from the patients that we interviewed for Dying to Get High. In my interviews with dozens of medical marijuana patients, almost all of them described the high as critical to what they experienced as the drug's medicinal effects. John, for instance, who was a 37-year-old living with AIDS, observed, quote, "Marijuana lifts me up past whatever symptoms I have at the moment, and it creates a sense of wellness and well-being that allows me to just function very much like I could before I was HIV positive. That feeling of well-being that we all take for granted when we're healthy, that mental state disappears when we feel sick. When I'm stoned, I find that I'm able to rise above it and press on. If you can take a substance that will make you feel well for even a brief moment in time, it can remind you what that's like, and that's just invaluable." Of course, some medical researchers like William Notcutt have talked about the value of people who are ill feeling better, not just simply having symptoms relieved. And as I watch at this conference, observe the really wonderful work being done by so many of you in looking at the value of consciousness-altering properties of botanicals in dealing with things like PTSD or end-of-life anxiety, it lifts my spirits and makes me more hopeful that maybe the therapeutic value of the high in cannabis can start to come out of the therapeutic closet. So I will stop there. It looks like I might have a minute or two for some questions if anyone has any.
Wendy, you have about 10 minutes for questions.
Well, fabulous. If anybody has any questions, otherwise we can move on to Amanda's. Oh, we do have a few questions.
Okay.
Yes.
Hi. Yes, I'm very interested in the idea of medicalization, how it kind of the social construction of marijuana as a medical and medicine in the path to legalize it. And I've watch that here. I'm very curious about that process here, and the idea that a lot of these hallucinogens need to be socially constructed as a pharmaceutical before they could. I'm getting the feeling from talking to people that step has to happen to get it legalized. Do you think that was true in marijuana and that it's going to be true with hallucinogens?
Well, I think it's extremely fortunate they did not succeed in fully pharmaceuticalizing marijuana. I mean, the federal government tried. One of the things that I was fascinated to learn, we talk about this in Dying to Get High, was that in the 1980s there were a series of clinical trials done in the US using botanical cannabis as a treatment for cancer-related nausea. And all of these state studies showed that, in fact, botanical cannabis worked well for cancer chemotherapy-related nausea. The federal government then slammed the door on any more clinical research. For 12 years, not a single FDA-approved study was allowed to go forward. But what the federal government did in addition to preventing research on the botanical was they funded research on the development of a synthetic THC, which was Marinol. They paid 75% of the development costs for Marinol, in the hopes that if you had a pharmaceutical, then the botanical would be unnecessary. And fortunately, that wasn't successful. They didn't slam that door. So I'm suspicious of the argument that the only way forward has to go through the pharmaceutical industry. And I'm not arguing that the pharmaceutical industry shouldn't be researching all these compounds. I think it's clear that they're very valuable. These plants are very valuable, have very valuable medicinal properties. It's good to be finding out ways to use them beyond the ways that we may be traditionally using them. But I don't think it's wise to have the pharmaceutical industry control it.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Hello, my name is Leo. My question is, have you written or spoken about the problems with a dualistic portion of society and what's it called? Forced heterosexuality, just kind of that
Forced,
whole
yes,
area.
I've certainly thought about forced heterosexuality.
Yeah,
in relation to
drug reform, but also this whole dualism and forced heterosexuality and how that creates problems where people are forced also to only do pharmaceuticals because the drug companies, have invested so much time and energy in that.
Okay, well, I'm not sure this is getting at what you're saying, but let me just say one of the things that fascinated me is I came out of a gender and sexuality studies background, and I started studying marijuana policy reform because of Valerie Corral and Michael Corral, who started the Women's Alliance for Medical Marijuana. They were living in my community. They were doing this amazing work. I was a sociologist. I thought, I have to write about this. But I actually came into it via a gender and sexuality lens. So and I was, as you may know, the early medical marijuana movement was gay men living with HIV and women living with cancer. I mean, that was a big part of the WHAM membership. So it was impossible not to recognize that that was an important thing that needed to be looked at. And then I started going to conferences, drug policy reform conferences, and I thought, okay, I'm not in gender and sexuality conference territory anymore. I would look around, where are the other queers? They must be here, they must be here. Where are the women? Thank you, Bia, by the way, of making this plant track so that there are more women presenting at this conference than there used to be. Yeah. So I don't know if that gets to your question, but it's certainly one that's near and dear to my heart.
You might have alluded to this in your remarks, and I know we don't deal in hypotheticals, but I guess we have to in this arena, and that is the medicalization of cannabis a la rescheduling it, as opposed to descheduling it. Wouldn't essentially the descheduling of cannabis actually make a lot of issues go away?
Yeah, this is not my area of expertise, but I would certainly say one of the dangers with rescheduling it is it could then become a prescription drug. I mean, it could be something that you could only access, on prescription. I actually think that train has left the station with, the states that have now legalized for all adult use. I think, thank God, we are in that moment where it would be very hard for the federal government to say, oh, you can only get this with a physician's prescription at a pharmacy. But I think if they hadn't been so obstinate, if the federal government hadn't dug in their heels and refused to allow any sort of medical use of marijuana, that could have been a risk earlier on. And I think it's a risk for other psychoactive botanicals.
But it really would cut out the pharmaceuticals, essentially. I mean, people who wanted to go see a practitioner who specializes in cannabis and health issues would be able to go, but anybody else wouldn't have to, right?
Perhaps, yeah. I mean, as I said, not my area of expertise, and I'm looking at a red light here, which says I have to stop. But if anybody wanted to talk to me more about this, I'll be in the back afterwards. Thank you so much.